Some nights, when darkness settles over quiet places, what moves within the shadows can turn the ordinary into a waking nightmare. From the eerie stillness of a remote Arizona drive-in where a towering figure unsettled an entire lot, to a Halloween hayride on a rural Missouri farm where a teen vanished and hay bales formed crude arrows into the woods. This video reveals 6 terrifying encounters that expose the real dangers that lurk in the wilderness, patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. The late summer air of August 13, 2025, was dry and brittle in rural Arizona, carrying the faint smell of dust and exhaust as families and couples settled in at the small drive-in theater on the edge of town. The night was calm, the desert winds barely stirring, and the crowd had come to escape into a classic horror film beneath the wide sky. Children leaned from open windows with sodas in their hands. Couples reclined on hoods and truck beds, and the whir of the old projector cut across the darkness as flickering images danced on the towering screen. It was a night meant for simple pleasure, the kind that was rare in such an isolated place, and the stillness only added to the fragile sense of safety. Just after midnight, as the movie reached one of its tense sequences, the beam of light from the projector tower shifted. For the briefest instant, a shadow crossed the screen, immense and broad-shouldered, moving too close and too high above the ground to belong to any person walking between cars. Murmurs rippled through the lot, parents turning their heads, teenagers pointing, and the sound of car doors clicking echoed faintly as some leaned forward to catch another glimpse. Nothing moved after that, and the film carried on, but unease had settled quietly into the gathering, as if the desert air itself had grown heavier. Minutes later, the projector tower groaned. The metal frame shuddered violently, the film stuttered across the screen, and the floodlights ringing the lot dimmed in unison. The crowd reacted with confusion first, some laughing nervously, others honking horns. But the sound of grinding steel made clear it was not a mechanical failure alone. Something had struck the structure. A low rumble traveled through the ground, not unlike the aftershock of a distant blast, and several vehicles began rocking as though in the grip of unseen hands. The night remained still, with no wind, no storm, nothing that could have explained the movement. In the concession area, a trailer that had been parked firmly beside the lot was later found shoved several feet from its spot, the gravel beneath it torn and dragged as though by enormous force. Staff who had been inside at the time described the sensation of being lifted, as though a massive shoulder had rammed the metal siding, sending drinks and popcorn crashing to the floor. They staggered out in confusion, only to find silence pressing down from the tree line beyond the open desert. Panic began to creep through the drive-in. Parents pulled children back into vehicles. Headlights flared, and some engines started as families considered fleeing the lot altogether. Yet there was no sign of intruders, no mob of rowdy youths running through the aisles, no explanation for the coordinated disruptions. The cars that had rocked so violently stood still again, but the tension was unrelenting. More than one witness later admitted that they could feel eyes on them, heavy and fixed, as if something far larger than themselves was waiting just beyond the ring of light. When the projector faltered once more, its beams sputtering and dimming across the screen, several patrons looked toward the tower and saw movement against its base. A dark form, massive and hunched, shifted briefly into the open before withdrawing into shadow. The sight lasted no more than seconds, but it was enough to silence the murmurs. What they had seen was not a prankster, not a group of teenagers with masks and props, but something built on a scale that dwarfed a man. The laughter that had carried nervously through the crowd earlier had vanished, leaving only the occasional cough, the hum of running engines, and the restless shuffle of gravel under tires. By the time police arrived in the early hours of the morning, many of the families had already left. Those who remained stood near their vehicles, unwilling to step further into the dark, while staff pointed out the damage to the tower and the concession trailer. Officers examined the lot with flashlights, their beams cutting across the dirt, and discovered prints unlike anything expected. They were broad, human-like, sunk deep into the ground, with weight no prankster could manage, each stride far too long for an average man. More puzzling still were the tire tracks of several vehicles, rearranged into neat arcs, as though lifted and rotated into place. The drivers swore they had not moved their cars, and the gravel beneath them showed drag marks where something massive had shifted the frames deliberately. The explanation given later was simple: teenagers. Police suggested local troublemakers had staged the entire event, rocking cars, shoving the concession stand, and stamping the ground with crude homemade prints to frighten the audience. Yet the theory faltered under the details. No group of young men could have shifted vehicles weighing thousands of pounds into precise arcs, nor left prints so deep the gravel compacted beneath them. No prank could explain the guttural sounds heard by several families, low, resonant growls that carried from the tree line, vibrating through the air with a depth no speaker system could replicate. For those who had stood in that gravel lot, the official line was little comfort. They remembered the sensation of being studied, the deliberate way the disturbances unfolded, one after another, as if measured to create maximum unease. They remembered the shadow that had crossed the screen, broad and impossibly tall, just as the horror film reached its most tense moment, a cruel echo of the fear they had come to watch. What unsettled them most was not that the creature had shown strength, but that it had shown control, choosing not to strike directly, but instead to disturb the order of the night and leave behind evidence of precision. Long after the police left, a few employees lingered to sweep up the mess. They claimed the silence of the desert was different now, heavier, as though the lot itself had been marked. The damaged trailer still leaned on its frame. The tower carried fresh dents along its supports, and the arcs of the rearranged tire tracks stood in pale contrast against the gravel. To those who had seen them, the message was unmistakable. Whatever had passed through the drive-in that night had no need to kill or steal. It had only wanted to remind them how small they were beneath its gaze. The night was quiet on Highway 299, the kind of silence that pressed against the windows of a long-haul truck and left drivers alone with the hum of their engines and the occasional murmur of a CB radio. It was August 29th, 2021, the air heavy and warm, and the road through the forest seemed endless beneath the dim wash of headlights. At a remote rest stop tucked into the trees, two truckers pulled their rigs side by side to stretch, smoke, and wait out the thick drowsiness of the night. Their names were Dale Parsons and Rick Henley, both seasoned men who had spent decades behind the wheel, comfortable with isolation and long miles, but respectful of the dangers that came with remote roads. The lot was dimly lit, the old fluorescent lamps buzzing faintly above cracked pavement, and the forest pressed close around the clearing, the tree line heavy and black. From the cab of his truck, Dale kept his CB radio alive, trading words with Rick as they prepared to catch a few hours of rest. They spoke of schedules, weather, and routes, their voices tired but steady, until Dale paused. He swore he had seen something shift between the pines, a movement too broad to be a deer and too tall to belong to a man. Rick, skeptical but alert, stepped out of his cab with a flashlight in hand, sweeping its beam across the gravel and into the dark. The two men grew quiet as the forest answered with silence, the kind of silence that carried weight, as if every living thing had gone still. Then, from deep within the timber, came a sound neither man could mistake for machinery or wind. A growl, low and resonant, rolled through the trees, vibrating in their chests like the engine of a massive machine. Dale reached for the radio, transmitting a quick, uneasy report. Something massive was moving near the tree line. That was the last message anyone heard from them. By dawn, when another driver pulled into the rest stop, the scene was chaos. One of the trucks stood untouched, its door hanging open, but the second rig looked as though it had been struck by a wrecking crew. The side of the cab had been peeled open, metal twisted outward in ragged sheets, as if enormous hands had ripped into it with no more effort than tearing cloth. Inside, the seats were stained and broken, but the absence of claw marks or torn flesh made clear that this had not been the work of an animal feeding in a frenzy. It was violence, precise and deliberate, the result of immense strength. Both men were found close to the cab, lifeless and broken. Their bodies bore no mauling, no deep gouges or shredding as would be expected from a bear. Instead, their injuries suggested crushing force, bones shattered as though they had been seized and hurled against the ground with inhuman power. More unsettling still were the details scattered around them. Their boots had been removed and placed side by side in the gravel, neatly aligned as if arranged with intent. On the hood of one truck, a flashlight stood upright, balanced carefully where it would be impossible for chance to have left it. These small acts, deliberate and ordered, suggested intelligence at work, not the chaos of a wild predator. Investigators arrived later that day, cordoning off the area as locals gathered on the edge of the lot, whispering among themselves. Enormous footprints were found in the dirt, pressed deep into the gravel with weight no prank could replicate. Each track stretched longer than a man's boot by half again, broad and heavy, and they led from the trucks into the shadowed forest beyond. Along the path, saplings had been bent and broken, snapped not at their bases but a dozen feet above the ground, as though something towering had passed and dragged massive arms through the branches. Officers recorded the details, took casts of prints, and moved quickly to conclude their work. The official report suggested a freak accident involving a bear. Wildlife officials claimed the trucks may have attracted a hungry animal, that the cab damage was caused by frantic swipes of claws, and the rest was a tragic consequence of two men confronting a predator at close range. Yet those who stood at the site could not reconcile the explanation with what they saw. Bears did not arrange boots with care, nor balance flashlights upright as if leaving behind a mocking message. Bears did not crush men without tearing, did not snap saplings 12 feet high, and did not leave behind tracks that looked eerily human in shape. Locals who drove the highway that night told of strange sounds echoing from the forest, deep growls that seemed to resonate more through the ground than the air, carrying a weight that froze them in place. Some admitted they sped past the rest stop, with eyes fixed on the pavement, unwilling to glance toward the trees where the noises seemed to follow. By morning, the warning was clear among those who lived near the road. No one should stop there after dark, not if they valued their safety. Whatever had moved through the rest stop had not only killed, but had done so with intent, leaving behind symbols of control as if to declare the space its own. The tragedy of Dale Parsons and Rick Henley spread quickly through the trucking community. Their names carried from CB radio to diner counter to loading dock. Men who had long believed themselves hardened against loneliness and danger found unease in the story, picturing their own rigs parked at some forgotten pull-off, with silence pressing in from the woods. Official voices continued to insist it was a bear, but few accepted that line. They had seen bears, knew their habits, and none had ever encountered one that peeled steel or arranged objects with purpose. Something else had walked out of the trees that night, and it had made no effort to hide its presence. In the weeks that followed, the rest stop emptied after dusk. Truckers planned their routes to avoid it. Locals drove past without slowing, and the lot stood as a hollow reminder beneath buzzing lamps. The scars on the truck were hauled away, the gravel swept, but the fear remained. Those who had stood in that clearing carried the memory of prints too large, too heavy, leading into the timber, where the air still held a weight of dread. The men who died there had not been mauled or hunted for food. They had been crushed and discarded, a show of power that left no doubt of deliberate violence. On Highway 299, the warning became simple and absolute. Keep moving after dark, and never stop where the trees grow close. On September 14, 1996, the small Missouri State Fair was winding down for the night, its rides creaking to stillness, and the crowds long since dispersed into the warm, humid dark of late summer. The air smelled faintly of fried batter and spilled soda, the kind of scent that clung to carnival grounds long after the laughter had gone. Jenna Dalton, a young ride operator tasked with closing down the Ferris wheel for the evening, moved through the quiet with practiced steps, her flashlight beam catching on scattered cups, paper bags, and the bright litter of forgotten tickets. It had been an ordinary fair week, full of noise and music and endless chatter. But now the silence felt unusually heavy, like a stage waiting for something unseen to step forward. She was rolling up the last section of chain near the entrance when she noticed movement at the edge of her vision. Between the Ferris wheel and a row of darkened concession stands, a shape slid into view, broad-shouldered, tall, and distinctly upright. At first, Jenna thought it was one of the carnival workers still lingering, maybe a prankster trying to startle her. But as her eyes adjusted, the scale of the figure unsettled her. It was far taller than any man she had ever seen, standing too straight and too wide across the shoulders to be mistaken for a human in costume. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, with a silence that was unnatural for something of that size. Her first instinct was to call out, but the words stuck. Instead, she stood rigid as the shadow approached the steel support beams of the Ferris wheel. The hulking form leaned against the structure, and the sound that followed was enough to make her knees weaken. The metal groaned under the pressure, a deep, strained vibration that echoed across the fairgrounds. It was not the sound of a casual bump or lean. It was force, applied deliberately, the way someone might test the strength of a wall or door. Jenna's flashlight trembled in her hand as she swept the beam across the nearby stands. Something else caught her eye, something she had not noticed before. Several of the concession tables had been altered in subtle ways. Buckets that had once been stacked neatly in storage now sat in strange formations, rising in uneven towers. Candy boxes had been rotated so their cartoon faces all pointed toward the tree line beyond the grounds. The arrangements were not random, nor the result of hurried workers packing up. They were deliberate, careful, and strange enough to make her stomach turn cold. Then came the sound. From the tree line, low and guttural, a growl rolled across the fairgrounds. It was not the bark of a dog or the rumble of a large cat, but something deeper, resonant enough to shake in her chest. The Ferris wheel loomed behind her, the groaning metal still vibrating faintly, and the heavy scent of damp earth carried on the night air as though something had stirred it loose. She turned her light back toward the shadow, but it was gone. The space between the rides and the concession stands stood empty, the silence even heavier than before. Fear jolted her into motion. Jenna ran across the gravel toward her car, her footsteps loud against the quiet, every stride carrying the weight of the unseen presence still clinging to her back. She felt watched, studied, as if her escape was part of the observation. The growl no longer sounded, but the sense of being tracked through the dark was stronger than any sound. By the time she reached her car and fumbled the keys into the lock, she could barely steady her breath. She started the engine and pulled from the lot with headlights burning too bright. But even as the fairgrounds disappeared in her rearview mirror, the feeling remained. Something had followed her, if not in body, then in intent. The next morning, staff arrived to begin dismantling the rides and packing the last of the booths. Rumors had already circulated of Jenna's shaken departure, but most dismissed it as exhaustion or nerves from working too late in the dark. Still, the rearranged objects could not be ignored. Tables bore the weight of buckets balanced into unstable stacks, and boxes faced uniformly toward the trees. Those who saw it exchanged uneasy glances but offered no explanation, preferring instead to keep their focus on the work. The Ferris wheel's support beam carried a faint new bend, small but undeniable, as if something had leaned against it with impossible strength. Officials later fielded Jenna's report with polite dismissal. They suggested her imagination had run away with her after a long shift, or that local pranksters had moved objects around for a laugh. Yet the accounts never quite faded. Workers remembered the weight of her fear the next day, the pallor in her face and the certainty in her words. The subtle evidence remained longer still, lingering in memory even after the fairgrounds were stripped bare and the lot emptied once more. Locals who had worked the fair whispered of the encounter for years afterward. They spoke of the heavy growl that some admitted they had heard faintly from their own trailers that night, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the earth more than the air. They remembered the strange patterns of the stacked buckets and the impossible bend of steel. No one could say why it had happened, only that it felt deliberate, as though the fairgrounds had been visited not by chance, but by choice. By autumn, when the carnival lights had long vanished and the grounds lay empty beneath falling leaves, the memory remained like a stain. Jenna never returned to work the fair again, and those who did admitted they sometimes felt uneasy while walking across the lot at night, glancing toward the trees as though expecting something massive to emerge. The official explanation stayed fixed, simple and dismissive, but the objects had spoken a different truth. They had not been scattered or damaged, they had been arranged. In the end, what haunted Jenna most was not the growl or the groaning steel, but the order she had witnessed in that chaos. Buckets balanced with intent, boxes turned in unison, and a silent watcher that had slipped away before she could look it fully in the face. It had not attacked her, had not broken through the fairgrounds in rage, but it had shown her that it was there, close enough to touch, strong enough to bend steel, and patient enough to leave behind signs she could never ignore. For Jenna, the silence that followed was not safety. It was proof that the encounter had only been the beginning, and that whatever had walked between the Ferris wheel and the stands would one day return. May 27, 2003, was a morning meant for solitude, and Emma Lowe, an experienced canoeist and angler, set out alone to paddle along the winding current. She was 30 years old, steady with her hands and confident in her skills, the kind of outdoors woman who found comfort where others felt isolation. Her small craft cut smoothly through the glassy surface, the dip of her paddle muffled by the weight of the fog, and no one on shore knew it would be her last trip. By midday, searchers were called after Emma failed to return to camp. What they found along a wide bend in the river unsettled them immediately. Her kayak was upright, perfectly balanced on a sandbar, not overturned or drifted, but carefully placed as though carried and set there with purpose. Nearby, her life jacket, paddles, and fishing gear had been arranged in concentric circles on the gravel, each piece laid with uncanny precision, forming rings around the center of the bar. The scene did not look like an accident or even a struggle. It looked intentional, crafted as though someone or something had taken time to build it. The strangeness only deepened with every step. Emma's boots were discovered hanging from a spruce branch overhanging the water, dangling nearly 8 feet above the surface, their laces tied together in a neat, deliberate knot. The effort required to suspend them there was not small, and the placement gave the unsettling impression of a warning or a display. Around the sandbar, enormous human-shaped footprints sank deep into the soft earth. They were far larger than any shoe could explain, their impressions clear in the wet ground, and they circled the bar multiple times. Some prints overlapped, as if whoever made them had stood and lingered, studying the arrangement before vanishing into the fog-draped timber. Rangers arriving on scene were struck by the scale of the disturbances. Along the riverbank, Several trees bore deep vertical gouges. The marks were not low to the ground, but raked high up the trunks, suggesting something of immense reach and strength had dragged against the bark. Even stranger, a row of smooth river stones had been laid out in a line along the bank, spaced with near-perfect evenness, each stone carefully chosen and placed like markers. No predator in the wild had reason to shape its environment this way. It was deliberate, meticulous, and undeniably unnatural. Despite the ominous evidence, authorities released their findings under the banner of accident. They suggested Emma had tipped her craft in the fog, tried to scramble to shore, and left her belongings scattered in confusion. They ignored the order of the concentric circles, the neatly suspended boots, the gouges reaching far too high for any human, and the footprints pressed deep into the sand. Their conclusion was tidy, but it convinced no one who had walked the site. Too many details were impossible to explain away. Locals who lived along the river remembered that night differently. Several had heard guttural sounds drifting through the fog, noises unlike any wolf or bear, resonant and long, carrying as if from something massive hidden just beyond the mist. One man swore he glimpsed a shadow on the opposite bank, towering and indistinct, moving slowly along the tree line before vanishing into the dense fog. These accounts, though whispered, carried weight among those familiar with the land. They spoke not of an accident, but of something that had chosen to reveal itself in strange, deliberate ways. Emma's disappearance left behind no body, no conclusive sign of where she had gone, only the careful arrangement of her belongings and the impression of power in the marks along the bank. The search continued for days, boats sweeping the river, dogs pacing the shoreline, but nothing new surfaced. The river gave back no answers, only the silent testimony of a sandbar marked with circles and prints too large to belong to any man. For her family, the uncertainty was worse than closure, the mystery more haunting than a simple tragedy. The site itself grew into a place of quiet dread. Rangers who patrolled the bend admitted they felt uneasy stepping onto the sandbar, their eyes drawn constantly to the tree line, their ears pricked for the low rumble that locals claimed echoed on misty mornings. The spruce with the boots remained a marker for some time, the branch heavy and scarred, until storms eventually took it down. The memory, however, lingered among those who knew the story, a memory not of an accident, but of deliberate presence. What made the scene unforgettable was not just the absence of Emma, but the order left behind. The circles of gear, the line of stones, the boots tied and displayed. It suggested not frenzy or instinct, but patience, intelligence, and intent. It was as if her disappearance was not simply the work of something massive, but of something that wanted to be known without being seen. The message was subtle yet undeniable. It had the strength to take, the precision to arrange, and the patience to linger. Years later, locals still spoke of the fog on the river and the echo of growls that carried through it. Travelers were warned against paddling alone in those stretches, and those who did often admitted they felt the weight of unseen eyes on their backs, the sense of something studying from the trees. Emma Lowe's name became tied not to her life, but to the mystery of her disappearance, her final moments lost to the dense mist that swallowed both her and the truth. The sandbar where her kayak had stood grew over with grass and reeds, the stones scattered by floods, but for those who had seen it firsthand, the memory of that arrangement remained vivid. It was not chance. It was not nature's randomness. It was deliberate, calculated, and left as if to remind them that the forest did not always move blindly. Something larger, something stronger, had shaped that place, and in its silence was the most chilling truth of all, that it had watched, chosen, and left its mark with patient intent. On the night of October 14th, 2019, two friends, Daniel Crow and Mark Talbot, drove through the winding Appalachian backroads of eastern Kentucky, returning from a late shift at a coal distribution yard where they had both been working temporary contracts. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of fallen leaves, the kind of dense autumn night where fog pooled in low valleys, and even the sound of crickets felt muted under the pressing silence of the hills. Their old Ford pickup rattled along the narrow road, its headlights cutting across the twisting branches that reached overhead like dark, skeletal arms. Both men were tired, their drive a routine journey, yet their last phone call to a relative would leave behind more questions than answers, with the strange disappearance and grim discovery that followed turning into one of the most unsettling cases ever whispered about in those mountains. The relative later reported that Daniel's voice sounded shaken, hurried, as if adrenaline had taken over. He said they were being followed by something massive moving along the tree line beside the road, something that broke branches as it moved, yet seemed to keep pace effortlessly with the speeding truck. The call cut off mid-sentence, and no one ever heard from either man again. Searchers later pieced together fragments of that final drive, the sharp turn onto a dirt turnout near an abandoned quarry, the engine still idling when the truck was found, and the disturbing evidence of what must have unfolded in the minutes after they stopped. The truck's driver's side door hung wide open, its headlights still glowing into the trees. 20 yards away, Daniel's body was discovered in a shallow drainage ditch, his skin bruised as though from blunt impacts, his chest and limbs bearing strange compression marks rather than claw or bite wounds. He was waterlogged despite the ditch being nearly dry, as though he had been held or submerged elsewhere before being left there. His boots were balanced neatly side by side on the hood of the truck, and his baseball cap hung high from a branch nearly 12 feet above the ground, swaying in the night breeze like a deliberate signal. Mark, the second man, was nowhere to be found, his absence becoming a silence that pressed just as heavily as the unsettling clues that remained. Investigators offered a tidy explanation, suggesting that both men had panicked when they believed an animal was chasing them, fled into the woods, and became separated in the confusion. They claimed Daniel succumbed to the elements or injuries sustained in a fall, while Mark likely wandered farther into the hills and was never recovered. Yet that neat answer faltered against the details at the scene. No claw marks, no animal tracks, no blood consistent with an attack. Instead, what stood in the damp clay soil were enormous human-shaped footprints pressed so deep that rangers had to crouch and photograph them in disbelief, each stride wider than any human could possibly manage, leading away into the trees before vanishing on rocky ground. Adding to the unease were the arrangements left behind. The boots, balanced with care, the hat hung high where no ordinary man could reach without a ladder, and the strange condition of Daniel's body all suggested that whatever they had encountered was not acting as an animal acts in chaos or hunger, but with patience and intent, as though leaving behind a message for those who would inevitably come looking. Objects that should have been scattered in panic had instead been carefully placed, as though to remind onlookers that something powerful had been in control of the scene. Locals living in the surrounding valley recalled the night clearly. They told of guttural roars echoing through the ridges, not the wild, unpredictable call of a bear or the scream of a cougar, but long, rhythmic bellows that carried across the hollows, vibrating against windows and rattling the nerves of anyone awake to hear them. Some claimed the sound was closer to a drum than a voice, a low resonance that felt deliberate, almost patterned, as if something enormous had chased its prey through the dark, but stopped to signal its victory in a way that no ordinary predator would. The search for Mark stretched on for weeks. Volunteers combed the dense woods, helicopters swept over the valleys, and dogs picked up and lost the scent within 100 yards of the turnout, as if the trail had ended suddenly without explanation. No scraps of clothing, no belongings, No signs of a struggle aside from the deep prints and the unsettling arrangements at the vehicle. Authorities quietly pulled back after months of fruitless searching, leaving Daniel's family with a body but marks, with only the torment of unanswered questions. For those who lived along Highway 421 and the twisting paths that connect the ridges, the case became a warning. Travelers were told not to stop on lonely stretches after dark, not to pull over even if they felt uneasy, and never to dismiss the strange noises that came rolling down from the mountains when fog settled in and visibility dropped to nothing. The story of Daniel and Mark was repeated in hushed voices at diners and gas stations, often accompanied by the reminder that the Appalachians have always carried mysteries older than memory, places where something vast still moved unseen. Officially, the incident was archived as an unfortunate disappearance tied to panic and poor judgment. Unofficially, the evidence remained too deliberate, too calculated to support such an explanation. And so the turnout where the truck was found became a place few dared to stop, even during the day. On October 30th, 2018, the air at Hollow Creek Farm carried the crisp bite of late autumn, the fields lined with pumpkins and hay bales, the sky fading to dark amber as night settled across the Missouri hills. Teen sisters, Kayla and Sophie, 17 and 15, joined their friends for the farm's annual haunted hayride, a tradition that drew crowds of thrill-seekers eager for scares among the cornfields and forested edges. Lanterns swung from wooden posts, their flickering glow casting elongated shadows across the winding path, and the scent of dried corn husks mixed with the faint tang of smoke from nearby torches. At first, the ride felt like any other Halloween attraction, full of staged monsters and mock screams. But as the wagon creaked into the denser woods behind the corn maze, the sisters noticed something that made the familiar excitement twist into unease. A low, guttural growl rolled through the trees behind the ride, echoing unnaturally across the clearing, deeper and more resonant than the performer's speaker or any creature they had expected. Kayla's grip tightened on the wooden railing as she scanned the shadows, her lantern casting long beams between the stalk, and through the flicker, she caught a glimpse of a massive figure moving upright among the trees. It was tall, broad-shouldered, and impossibly silent, slipping from one patch of shadow to the next, ease of something that belonged to the darkness itself. Sophie froze beside her, eyes wide. But before either could react further, the wagon lurched forward, carried by the horses along the uneven track, leaving the figure behind like a shadow that had never been. By the end of the ride, unease had transformed into panic. One of the sisters' friends, a boy named Liam, had vanished during a brief stop to navigate the maze, and no one remembered seeing him exit the ride or return to the wagon. The staff insisted he must have wandered off or gotten lost, but the sisters' eyes were drawn to the scene around the hay bales lining the path. They were stacked unnaturally, forming crude arrows that pointed toward the edge of the forest, as if guiding some invisible force in a deliberate pattern. Footprints pressed deep into the soft earth, each over 2 feet long, circled the ride path in a regular loop, then ended abruptly, as if whoever or whatever had made them had stepped into the shadows and simply vanished. Kayla struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. The hayride, meant for laughter and staged fright, had become a landscape of chaos and subtle precision. She noticed the spacing of the bales, the way the footprints angled toward the trees, and the unnatural stillness in the forest beyond. It was as though someone, or something, had orchestrated the events of the evening with intent, using the hay bales and paths to herd and manipulate, leaving behind signs for anyone perceptive enough to note it. The thought made her stomach tighten, a gnawing fear that went beyond the usual thrill of Halloween. Locals spoke of silent watchers on nights like this, predators that moved along the hills and ridges, observing and manipulating humans without ever revealing themselves fully. Stories told of missing hikers, strange arrangements of objects in the woods, and guttural roars that left echoes in valleys long after the source had disappeared. Kayla had always dismissed these tales as folklore, but that night, the stories seemed to manifest around her. Every shadow felt like a present, every sound carried weight, and every glance at the forest reminded her that she and Sophie were being observed. The ride concluded in a blur, the sisters barely noticing the other passengers and staff around them. Fear gripped them so tightly that it outweighed any rational thought. Their senses, heightened by adrenaline, cataloged every detail of the bales, the soil, the spacing of objects. When they finally stepped from the wagon, the mist from the nearby creek clung to their shoes, and the cold air carried the faint odor of damp earth and broken leaves, a scent that seemed to linger unnaturally in the silence. Liam's absence was the most immediate horror, but the calculated marks left behind, the arrangement of the environment, and the echoes of growls in the distance suggested something larger and more intelligent than any human prankster could accomplish. Staff scoured the area, flashlights sweeping the corn maze and tree line, but Liam was gone. Search parties called in later found nothing beyond the deep, unnatural footprints that circled the wagon path and disappeared into the darkened forest. The crude arrows of hay bales and the faint impressions of what might have been dragged along the ground. There were no signs of struggle, no drag marks leading far into the forest, and yet the evidence suggested a presence that had been deliberate and precise, working with patience rather than panic. The local sheriff later attributed the disappearance to a lost teen and poor visibility, but the parents and the sisters knew the truth felt far less mundane. For weeks afterward, the sisters could not shake the memory of that night. Every rustle in the trees, every distant howl, and every shadow reminded them of the figure they had glimpsed, of the unseen force that had herded them with intelligence and left behind its subtle message. Sleep was haunted by the repetition of crude arrows in their dreams, by footprints that circled their minds endlessly, and by the echo of growls that seemed to originate not from the woods, but from inside their own heads. The farm returned to normal each year, with other teens enjoying the thrill of the haunted hayride, but Kayla and Sophie never returned, unwilling to face the risk of encountering the silent watcher again. Eventually, the hayride became just another part of the local Halloween lore, the kind of story told in hushed tones to frighten children and thrill visitors. Yet for those who had been there on October 30th, 2018, the terror was real and calculated. Nothing had moved chaotically. Nothing had acted without purpose. The figure in the trees had herded, observed, and left its mark in ways subtle and deliberate, ensuring that fear lingered long after its passage.